Hello, everyone, and welcome back to Motley Fool Conversations. I'm Motley Fool contributing stock analyst Rachel Warren, joined by my fellow Motley Fool contributor Rich Limelu, and today we're delighted to welcome Zack Kass to the show. Zack is a global AI advisor and former head of go-to-market at OpenAI, where he led the teams responsible for sales, partnerships, and customer success. He was at OpenAI when the company launched ChatGPT in 2022. He's advised hundreds of Fortune 1000 companies like Coca-Cola, Morgan Stanley, possesses over 15 years of experience in the tech industry. Zack is a self-described techno-optimist and AI futurist. He's focused on making AI accessible, helping leaders understand its transformative potential beyond dystopian narratives, and guiding businesses to leverage generative AI and navigate the AI revolution. Zack is also the author of the upcoming book, The Next Renaissance, AI and the Expansion of Human Potential. The book provides an optimistic look at how AI can become a collaborative partner, democratize opportunity, and optimize rather than detract from humanity's potential. Zack, we're really excited to talk with you today and discuss your book. Welcome to the show.
Thanks so much for having me, Rachel.
You know, you started your career in AI almost 15 years ago, as you say in the book, and, at OpenAI as head of go-to-market, you helped the company grow from $1 million to over $2 billion in annual revenue. But you say that nothing really prepared you for November 30th, 2022, the day that ChatGPT was released. So I'd love if you would tell us about your background, your journey, what led you to here, and then walk us through that experience, that moment in time when the world was introduced to ChatGPT.
Sure. Well, I'm not sure that anything would have prepared me for that date. So it's, I was just, even as you framed the question, I was thinking like, what would have prepared me? But I went to Berkeley for college. I studied history and computer science. I graduated and got a job at a machine learning company. And the focus was on, at the time, building data sets. It was a company called Figure 8, building data sets for the purposes of machine training. Of course, now this has become exceptionally normalized and quite lucrative. Companies like Mercor and Labelbox and Surge, et cetera. And we were principally selling data at the time to companies like Facebook, Google, and Amazon, who could afford these large statistical machine learning models. And they were mostly just doing product recommendations. And I stayed there long enough to graduate to a company doing large language models for the purposes of machine translation. That company was called Lilt. And I stayed there long enough to graduate to OpenAI. And so I joke that at a time where everyone was making money hand over fist in things like cloud storage or e-commerce or sales optimization software, I just stuck around in AI long enough for it to pay off. And at OpenAI, for a long time, if you emailed sales or support you arrived at my inbox. And that started to change as we started to build API products. It became more popular. Of course, GPT 3.5, most people don't remember, but it was state of the art and really impressive in many ways. And then of course, ChatGPT, November 30th, 2022. And what was particularly impressive about that is that I had felt like OpenAI should have arrived much sooner. My case to anyone who would listen was that GPT 3.5 was a commercially viable or economically viable model that people should have been adopting much faster and weren't. And it was publicly available in the API since June 2022. So you had this stretch of about 4 months, where people could have built ChatGPT and did. And ChatGPT was, as I remind people, not a research breakthrough, it was an application breakthrough. And it serves, for me, this incredible reminder that the application layer matters so much. You have to build things that people can simply use. Otherwise, you cannot change consumer or even enterprise behavior in a material way. And that moment is indelible, in certainly a lot of technological history, but also my personal history, because a lot of us went home that night not sort of thinking anything of it. I mean, the purpose of it really was to create an experience so that a CEO could come to the website, use the product, and then tell their CTO that they should build something with the API. And then, of course, what happened was, hundreds of thousands and millions of downloads, and then billions of downloads later. And it was amazing. And it sort of thrust OpenAI into the forefront. It materially changed how people understood AI would work, but it wasn't a scientific breakthrough. It simply put everything in a context that made sense.
Wow. I think it's a really fascinating framework you laid out there that maybe even differs in some ways from the investor and public perception of how we viewed that kind of debut of ChatGPT to the market. Something that really stuck out to me in your book as I was reading it was you said, we can't chart where we're going with AI without knowing where we've been. As we look at how AI has developed over the decades, maybe first take us through what you define as artificial intelligence in the modern age, and what are some of these kind of key historical milestones that can help us form a more cohesive picture of the past, present, and future of AI?
Well, the history of AI is, I mean, I don't know, it's maybe it's banal, but I think it's sort of important. We started talking about thinking machines. The theory of thinking machines has been around for a long time, 150 years. And we started talking about AI, artificial intelligence, as a term in 1954. And the computer science community has sort of since then been talking about ways to sort of solve this, what was for a long time a very theoretical problem or a theoretical idea, which is, machines that were as smart as humans. And that had this like slow and steady incremental improvement from 1954 to call it 2017, where sort of every year the model got a little bit bigger, a little bit better, but on like a 2% annual rate. And it got to a point where the models, in order to get value, you had to do, and you had to build these very large, very expensive models that were prohibitive, really, for most people. Which is why for a period of time, certainly during the early internet age, the companies that did very well were the companies that could afford, in many cases, these huge machine learning teams and tons of data to build these models that sold you a slightly more aligned widget. And if you could do that well enough at massive scale, then you could make a lot more money on ads or product recommendations, etc. That changed. And it changed not gradually, but suddenly. So the rate of improvement in statistical modeling nothing was going to give there. Where it really changed was in 2017, when 8 Google researchers wrote a paper called "Attention is All You Need." And in this paper, they argued a very simple idea, which is that we had been building statistical machine learning models all wrong. And then instead of building models that think in straight lines, we should build models that think in parallel. And the parallelization of data, which was sort of the transformer architecture idea, is what thrust this the industry forward. And we quickly adopted the transformer architecture in the circles that were paying attention. Amazing to think that this was 8 years ago almost. OpenAI was paying attention. Now, what's really amazing is Google releases this paper, "Attention is All You Need," announces the transformer architecture, and then does nothing with it. They sit on it. And Sergey Brin recently in an interview was like, yeah, mea culpa. Like, we definitely messed up. OpenAI takes this paper. There were a couple folks at the company at the time that were sort of espousing neural nets. And so it comported with their way of thinking. Ilya, principally among them, had been talking about neural nets since 2012. He's like, this is the way of the future. They pick up this architecture and they run with it. And what comes is GPT, Generative Pre-trained Transformer. That's what it stands for. And that's the first one. That comes out in 2019. And then GPT-2 in 2020 and GPT-3 in 2021. And not many people are paying attention, but you're seeing this like parabolic improvement in cost, in performance, and in actual like training capability. And that is sort of the way to think about it is AD and BC, in sort of the most basic terms, before architecture and after, or before transformer and after transformer. And what happens then is everyone floods the zone. ChatGPT doesn't actually produce a research breakthrough. What it does is it forces everyone to come back and go, oh, it's the transformer architecture. And then you get text models, video models, image models, speech models, you name it. And we're now math models, vector models, 3D models. We're now building a world of AI that has a encyclopedic understanding of our known universe. And we are approaching human intellectual equivalence or superiority in many cases. And the next step in this are world models, models that aren't just sort of capable of text or video, but capable of actually making sense of the world. So sort of the sort of next jump in computer vision and modeling. And then the next advancement are narrowly brilliant models. So what I think we are approaching now are models in probably the next 5 to 10 years that are capable of, for example, doing exceptional drug discovery advancements or exceptional radiology pathology scans or exceptional architectural renderings. And that's on the near-term horizon. Like that's, to me, agents are exciting because on a consumer basis, and we can talk more about AI agents, but the really big thrusts are going to be these world models and then these quite remarkable sort of narrowly brilliant models that start really changing how we do a lot of jobs.
Zach, you've touched on kind of how quickly it took off. It was almost a parabolic kind of launch for you guys. That night you realized how big it was. What did that reveal about the latent demand for intelligence?
That's a great question. Well, okay. So I wrote a paper recently that I think is like actually my best work. I don't know how well it's written is the problem, but I spend a lot of time. One of my crusades is to convince people that the addiction to social media, the addiction to the device is not an indictment on technology, it's an indictment on the screen. That actually, when we talk about social media as being a problem and we talk about AI as being party to it, we're confusing two things. And one of the problems that I attribute, the symptoms that I attribute to social media and the device, the display itself, is that we unlocked what I call unmetered information or unmetered knowledge. We gave ourselves access to everything we've ever known without the actual ability to make any sense of it in any context. We told 15-year-olds who had literally never left their zip code about Darfur. We showed them images of the war in Gaza. We told them that the climate was being destroyed and showed them images of ice caps melting. And it's not that we lied to them. It's that we told them a bunch of things without any historical context. And one of the reminders of the tragedy of what I call the tragedy of unmetered information is when you spend time with kids, they are smarter than any of us were at that age. And yet they seem to make less sense of the world. They describe a world that is crumbling, despite the fact that all the evidence is to the contrary, or most of the evidence is to the contrary, but they don't have any of the tools that most adults have to make sense of it. And by the way, we barely have tools to make sense of it, which is why so many adults will tell you the world is getting worse all the time. And when you press them and you say, okay, pick a date you'd rather be born, they can't. Now, I say this because there are two desires for intelligence. One of the desires for intelligence is to discover more of our known universe and to thrust forward novel sciences, right? We have locked up so much information. We probably know somewhere buried in all of our files the key to curing cancer, but we can't find it. Right? That's one of the other tragedies of unmetered information. Buried in the haystack is the needle somewhere. And the desire for intelligence is in unearthing that information. And you see this when people submit, like people put these incredibly long documents into ChatGPT and tell me, hey, find the part that matters most to me. That's that work. And then there is this other piece, which is I think people more and more realize that they almost know too much. They don't explicitly say this, but a lot of people are starting to seemingly take more comfort in the idea that they might be wrong. There is like a greater interest in seeking out, some of the way this is playing out is people are seeking out conspiracy theorists. They're like, oh, maybe I need to totally reconsider everything I knew about the world because they've been lying to me for so long. And in other cases, people are going on YouTube and saying, I want to learn about this thing because I don't think my teacher is teaching me properly. And so you're seeing this rise of, sort of this new birth of sort of personal agency among especially a younger generation who's like, maybe everything I know is sort of wrong. And in many ways, AI can solve that. And so you have these two like collaborative forces driving people to want more intelligence. On one end, people are like, how do we solve world hunger with all the information we have? And on the other, it's like, hey, how do I actually become an actor in my play? Like, how do I make sense of what I'm hearing and seeing? Because my brain can't do it on its own.
Okay. And obviously we're a website and a podcast for investors. So for investors, the first question I was going to ask you was kind of how early in AI are we? But probably the better question is, are there any misconceptions out there from your perspective of how early we are?
Well, I'll ask you, Rich, where do you think humans are in the human experience?
Third inning.
Are you a baseball fan?
Yeah, third inning.
Oh, you just said it. You just said third inning.
Yeah.
Yeah, it's funny. People either pick second inning or eighth inning, or maybe I've heard some people do nine. Third is great. I like third a lot. Yeah, let's say we've been around a couple 100,000 years, and we'll be around for a few million years. Seems reasonable. I ask this, by the way, because I ask it of everyone. Because when someone's like, "Where are we in AI?" I'm like, "Well, where do you think we are in the human experience?" Because that sort of answers the question. Like, I can't convince someone that humans are going to be around for millions of years. Like, that's just not. I mean, I can try. I can like make an argument, but like, it's not going to work. So when someone's like, "Well, how early are we in AI?" I'm like, "Well, it depends on how long you think we're going to be here." Because if you think we're going to be here a long time, then we're super early in AI. But if you think you're not long for this world, then we're super late in AI. I mean, it's like AI's. It's a flash in the pan because so are we. And I happen to think that humans are destined for a lot. I happen to love the human experience. I happen to love humans, and I happen to believe that there's a lot of beauty in the human experience, and that in terms of from an investment standpoint, all of this technology is effectively we should almost regard it as brand new. And it's exceptionally early in all of it. And then maybe the next question is, well, what about, is there a bubble? Like where do we sit in the investment? I don't want to put words in your mouth, but where do we sit in the investment timeline, and how much of this needs to shake out? And I have sort of three answers to that. By the way, I don't know if you were going to ask that, but maybe I answer.
I'd love to hear your take. Yeah.
Okay. Well, I have three answers, and all three of them are hot. One of them is sort of has a negative connotation. One of them has a positive connotation. One of them is neutral. The negative. I'll start with the negative one because this is people hate this take, by the way, but it's true. This is how I feel. I don't really care if there's a bubble. I don't care, and I'll tell you why I don't care. I don't care because I've studied history long enough to know that bubbles pop, and sometimes it's healthy. Like sometimes market corrections are actually quite good. You hate being a part of it, but like you are often a beneficiary. A lot of people are beneficiaries on the back end of it, as long as things sort themselves out. And short-term pain can lead to long-term growth and progress. I'm not, by the way, sure that there is a bubble. I just don't spend a lot of time talking about it. And by my calculation, the people who really need to worry about it are like hedge fund managers and individuals who are so uniquely exposed to AI. By the way, I am one of them. Like, let's be clear. I mean, it's not like I want my net worth to take a material hit. It's that I know that this takes a long time to play out. Now, my other hot take is that even if there is a bubble, what we are building right now, the AI infrastructure, is super valuable. And in particular, the energy infrastructure. I think that the forcing function here around the AI sprint, the broad AI infrastructure sprint, is a net positive for everyone because it will spool up not 40% more energy, but 1,000% more energy. And 1,000% more energy is only tenable if you have step functional breakthroughs in energy. So you either need, for example, geothermal, of which there's like 100 gigawatts in outside Yuma. You need or a solar field the size of Texas, or fusion and small modular reactors. And that forcing function is going to drive us into a new energy paradigm. And what I always say to people is unmetered intelligence is very cool. Do you know what's cooler? Unmetered energy. Like, if nothing else, if AI drives us to a place where we can build desalination and vertical farms so that everyone on Earth, thanks to energy advancements, can have clean drinking water and fresh produce, we will have done an enormous amount. There are second order consequences, much like the railroads, to this stuff. Now, also, one of the things that I talk about is there is a convenience to some of the infrastructure. When we built the shopping malls in the 90s, the assumption was you can't overbuild a shopping mall. Just build shopping malls. Build as many as you can everywhere. And LA went on this strip mall craze in the 80s and 90s. The problem with shopping malls, and there are basically two, I argue. The first is that they were bad infrastructure bets. A lot of people were underwater on shopping malls and like have had to, sort of make whole on debt because we built a shopping mall of the 90s for the internet of the 2000s. And retail did what it did. The real issue with shopping malls, and the reason that people should be pissed, is not that they were bad investments, it's that they are occupying land that we would love to be housing. The real issue with so much of the dead infrastructure of the 80s and 90s is that we built it in lieu of the thing we need most now, housing, and it is prohibitively expensive to repurpose. So you wander a city and you're like, damn, it sucks that place exists. I live in Santa Barbara, Paseo Nuevo. I mean, this is like super niche and super personal. We have a shopping mall literally down this street that has been effectively dead for 5 years. In a city that is thriving, it is a blight. And repurposing it into housing has become a political nightmare. It is a battle that no one seems to be able to win because the costs to actually do it are pretty great. You have to tear stuff down. It's a mess. It's not just a pile of dirt. And that sucks. And my point is, if we build a bunch of these data centers in Iowa, even if we don't need them, in 10 years, no one's going to walk around and be like, damn, I wish that was something else. And I think that there's like a huge importance right now to prioritizing land use and making sure that we get stuff right. Whereas the energy can actually be distributed pretty well, sort of well, the power much less so. And if the worst thing that happens is we basically build a bunch of desalination plants and vertical farms where these, or next to these data centers, then so be it. And my third take is net neutral, and this is investment advice, or this is not investment advice, but you can sort of interpret it as such. The short bet on Nvidia is not a bad one, but it's not a bad one for the wrong reason. Like, it's not for the reasons most people think. Most people are like, well, there's like that midwit meme argument where like the little wit is like, why do we need so many GPUs? And the midwit is like, don't you see this is the infrastructure of the future? And the genius big brain is like, why do we need so many GPUs? And that's sort of my argument, which is that the genius and the little wit, the little wit actually get it somewhat right for different reasons, which is that the GPU just might not be actually the architecture of the future. We might be building something that is going to be obsolete, not because we don't need it. The demand for AI will certainly grow. Same with the demand, by the way, for shopping. The demand for commerce grew by almost an order of magnitude between 1980 and 2010. And also, people stopped buying as much stuff in store because they could buy stuff online. And I think what we're going to observe is that as the market, and the market hates 800-pound gorillas, hates them. The market hates that Nvidia is sort of dripping water where it so pleases in sort of like these gaping, thirsty mouths, and is going to try to solve it. And there are two solutions to this. One is new architecture, one is sort of new hardware, and the other is the CPU. What I think people are discounting is that the CPU is already able to do so much of the inference. And the CPU, as the solution to inference, solves security problems, privacy problems, and cost problems. It's just so much less expensive to run AI at the edge on the device. And in fact, Kimi K2, the state-of-the-art model similar to OpenAI's GPT-2 or GPT 1.2, can run on my Mac Studio. So we're already at a place where we can localize this infrastructure. So if you're an investor out there trying to make sense of this, it's like, look, bet long on AI, but pick your bets carefully on infrastructure. And some of the infrastructure is sort of indelible, like energy. Don't think you can overinvest in that, quite honestly. And some of it may be more fragile, like the actual GPU or the data center itself that's only designed to house the GPU.
Okay, great. Thank you.
You've talked a lot today about unmetered intelligence, the different phases of the integration of AI as kind of this ubiquitous presence in our daily life. And a lot of that goes back to what you talk about a lot in your book, the AI Renaissance, which obviously has implications for consumers, of course, for us as investors. What do you view as being the most kind of vital conditions to usher in the AI Renaissance? And what does that look like in practice?
Well, so I borrow, first of all, it's funny. We basically debated naming the book Unmetered Intelligence, which I think would have been better sticky IP, but it is much less approachable. And so, like, if I wrote another book tomorrow, I'd write Unmetered Intelligence, and I would sort of expand on the ideas in the first one. The point of the next Renaissance is actually, I wrote it for my mom. I wrote the book for everyone on Earth right now, the educated layperson who is desperately trying to make sense of this moment and for whom there are very few tools. And I part of the reason that and my mom's a well-educated woman who just doesn't know a whole lot about AI, and there are a lot of these people. And I sort of, what I lay out in it are some complex ideas, one of which is unmetered intelligence, the theory that intelligence is in fact just a resource. And like water and foodstuffs and electricity and the internet before it, it will go from very scarce to very abundant. And in the same way that like owning a sort of, it's very hard to compete on a basis of electricity anymore, right? Like owning the utility matters, but like you can't actually go out and raise money to say, I have access to more electricity unless you are literally building the power plant. And my argument here is sort of the same, which is that intelligence will go the way of these resources. And that when we commoditize and utilitize things, good things happen. My net bet is that the world gets a lot better because we are making the cost of this critical resource so cheap. And if you argue, and I do, that we measure the human experience on basically human progress on two axes, how free are we to pursue our own version of joy, and how inexpensive is it to do so? Right? On one axis, you need governments to protect freedoms and personal liberties. And on the other, you need private market to drive the cost of goods and services down through technological innovation and utilitization. And the path that AI is on is basically the best evidence that I can make that we're commoditizing, utilitizing a critical resource. And what happens when we arrive at unmetered intelligence, that's up to us, and I mean us sort of collectively, cities, states, governments, or countries, and communities. And there is there's a bunch of upside and a bunch of downside, and we sort of lay all that out in the book.
You know, the other question that I think arises from that is the U.S., for example, has chosen a relatively deregulated and sector-specific approach to AI thus far, right? We also can go to the EU. They've had a more sweeping framework from their AI Act of 2024. You can look at China, which is another key AI market, and they've chosen the path of open source models, but they still have this very kind of extremely specific set of guardrails in place. What does this tell us about what AI governance can look like? How could it develop in the coming years and decades? I think that's a big question that investors have.
We are running right now globally about 3 experiments. We are running an experiment in Europe, an experiment in, well, maybe 4. An experiment in Europe, an experiment in the US, an experiment in China, an experiment everywhere else. In Europe, you are seeing a pro-consumer or a consumer protectionism position, or societal protectionism position, or just protectionism, which is what Europe is famous for. And it is already having pretty bad economic consequences. People are less likely to build foundational models in Europe. Companies are less likely to adopt them. It is a slow-moving environment that has always been culturally a little conservative and is now on a regulatory basis reinforcing this sort of disposition. Then you have the U.S., which has taken, as you pointed out, a fairly deregulated approach. And in fact, what they've done, the administration and the president and David Sachs, his AI czar, have said, actually, we don't want the states to even pass any policy at all. We want to limit the amount of policy that can be passed at the state level, and we're gonna sort of sit and wait and observe at the national level. And then in China, you actually have aggressive policy that's driving, as you pointed out, open source innovation and development, where the government is actually taking a fairly heavy hand, and not even the national government, although the party is, but actually each of the states are now competing. So, I mean, for whatever the listeners know about China, the states are quite competitive with each other. And the mayor of Shanghai competes with the mayor of Beijing to have better schools and better AI startups. And so that's one of the major thrusts right now, is how do we build more of this technology? And this is going to play out. And then of course you have the rest of the world, which is sort of like basically either adopting some scope of Europe or some scope of China or the US, but they are sort of slower on the adoption curve, so it matters less. I have 2 theses. The first is, I think that we are going to measure economic vibrance or economic success over the next 20 years, not by countries who manufacture, but by countries who adopt the technology. AI adoption, more than AI manufacturing or AI development, will matter. And for reasons that I think are maybe pretty obvious, which is like the downstream consequences of actually using this incredible technology effectively may be far more lucrative than the actual upstream consequences of selling it to people. You just won't be able to compete if the cobbler's children has no shoes. The other thing is, I think all of this misses the forest through the trees, which is there are basically 3 things that we should be talking about from a governance standpoint, and we're not talking about them enough. The first is alignment, the second is explainability, and the third is bad acting. And in my opinion, all the conversation around responsible AI and ethical AI, which have sort of gone away, as best I can tell for the most part, were actually a total distraction from the issue at hand, which is, how do we make sure that we are setting standards and requiring that model manufacturers build models that are aligned to human interests and human values? And how do we make sure that those models can properly explain themselves? And the explainability problem is one that's not talked about very, very much. And I sort of will die on the hill talking about it, which is the governance of making sure that the model can retrieve all the information that it considered and tell you its biases and weights. Because the only reason these models work are biases. And we don't actually want them to not be biased. What we want to make sure is that we know what they're considering when they make a decision. We know what their bias is. And the third is bad acting. And I'm of the mind that we are spending way too much time right now talking about the us versus the model, the Terminator effect, or even us versus another state, the international conflict effect. I cannot convince people fast enough that our real threat is a low resource bad actor, not a high resource bad actor. that the asshole in the garage is a far greater concern to you and me, empowered by AI, than the average nation state. And I spend a lot of time with local governments, state governments, and national governments, talking to them about the importance of passing punitive law to basically dissuade people and swiftly stop low resource bad acting using this technology, because if we don't, it will get very weird. 9% of the population is antisocial. 5% are psychopathic. About 4% have figured out how to make crime pay, even though they know it's bad. And we are going to empower them. And I think that we need to take a much less tolerant approach to this than we have to a lot of other issues in the United States, including domestic violence, including alcoholism, and others that really tear at the fabric of society. We have to decide very clearly that this is not something we're going to tolerate.
Zack, in the book, you look at a couple of different, kind of broad sectors: healthcare, financial services, education. I'll throw in media. Do you think who do you think stands to gain kind of on the earlier side, and who do you think stands to gain, kind of longer term of those, kind of various sectors?
Well, I guess let's start with healthcare. So on the early side, it's the startups, pretty clearly. Function Health, all the companies now selling tools to doctors. There are a bunch of really cool AI startups now building better tooling for doctors, nurses, etc. And they're going to have a great time because healthcare practitioners are actually adopting AI almost faster than any other market. And that's not really a surprise because they are underwater. None of the constituents in healthcare are happy, except really the insurers, and everyone wants it to get better. So I think that the short term, it's the startups, and if you can get access to these private companies that are doing even dictation or doctor apps, you'll have a great time. Then there's a bigger sort of play and sort of question, which is who wins in the end? And my argument is consumers. My argument is us. I don't know that I would bet firmly on the hospital, on the box itself. I think that is a stranger bet, although it seems possible. I think it's very unlikely that that the hospital requires the physical box. And so if you have a bunch of old infrastructure, you might feel really exposed to risk. But I think it's very clear that we are going to do better collectively on a healthcare basis in the next 20 years. And that's not financial advice. That's just me being really glad and excited that we're going to reduce the cost of exceptional healthcare, and that most people are going to know a lot more about themselves than even the ultra wealthy do today. That precision medicine and data are going to present people with the opportunity to really control their personal outcomes. But if I had to bet on a group, I'd probably bet on sort of small upstart practices like Function Health. And I think what they're doing is amazing. In terms of financial services, I think that the bet has to be on big banks for now. But the truth is, the reason for this is that small and medium-sized financial services institutions are just not well equipped to adopt this stuff. It's not that they can't. It's not that they shouldn't. It's not that their customers don't want them to. I mean, there are hundreds of good-sized regional banks in the United States whose customers would love to bank with them instead of Chase or Citi. And the problem is, in 5 years, when they've sort of automated when Chase or Citi or Wells has automated a ton of stuff, small banks are going to look really antiquated. And I worry about that a lot. And in fact, I worry about it so much that when people talk to me about Code Red and OpenAI and the what about the AI bubble? I'm like, look, if you're in the AI arena today, you're doing fine. You're going to do fine. Everyone's going to do fine. What we need to be concerned about is not the AI companies. It's the Global 5,000. It's the companies with 5 billion to 200 million EBITDA who have a lot of employees, a lot of customers, a lot of assets, but cannot adopt this technology fast enough because their competitors, their big competitors are winning. And I think in the financial services case, the rich are going to get richer. I bet that Chase looks more like a technology company in 10 years than it does a financial services institution. And then on education, I mean, the funny thing is for your listeners, a lot of people have lost money and most people have lost money. Most investors have lost money in an ed tech investment. I mean, like if you've been investing long enough, you've lost money in ed tech because the promises were so good and the delivery was so hard. And basically with like one or two exceptions, these companies all struggled. And that's changing. And in fact, I'm speaking today at my high school, the high school that I went to growing up, to an all hands assembly, an all teacher assembly, and all student, and basically espousing the opportunity for precision learning at scale and a return to a sort of a more Waldorf or Rudolf Steiner view of the world. And in the book, we highlight three luminaries who I think are going to get this right. One is Eva Moskowitz, who runs the largest charter school in the country, actually probably the largest public school, by definition, that you've never heard of in New York City or New York. And she has, I think now 30,000, I mean, just so many students. And it's outperforming all the other schools by an incredible margin. It's a traditional school. It looks as you would expect it. But it's doing way better. And she's just taken a traditional schooling model and done way better. And you could make the argument that that's the future of education. We also look at Mackenzie Price, the CEO of Alpha School. Alpha School is the pioneer of 2-hour learning. They take a learning module and they give customized education to every kid in a 2-hour window every day. And then they send them outside to do life skills, physical activity, game theory, and sports. Amazing. I have issues with it, but I think it's incredible. And then I went and studied Rudolf Steiner, the father of Waldorf, who basically watched 150 years ago, the industrialization of education and wept. I mean, you can almost see the tears on the page as we hauled kids off to these traditional industrialized classrooms. And he described the death of the soul and spirit of every child. Now, what he could not have known, but that we now know and had to acknowledge, is that the industrialization of education was critical to arrive at this moment. But it may not be going forward. And so if you're making bets on education, what I would consider is that industrial education, the one where 40 kids sit in the classroom and stare at a chalkboard while someone teaches them how to pass a test, may not have the same function that it used to. And it certainly already lacks the form. We have the Faustian bargain is we basically sacrifice the soul and spirit of a generation in our traditional education. And I think that there is an opportunity for new schools, new technology, and also all this adjacent stuff. I am betting very, very long right now on activities, after school programs, physical spaces for kids to engage, museums. In fact, it'll be announced tomorrow, so I can tell this on the pod. I bought, or I'm a part owner in the women's professional volleyball team in the LOVB league, because I am basically sure that there is going to be this massive return, a resurgence in the physical world when we realize that we actually hate the device, which we do. We hate the screen, and that we want kids outside. That actually raising a wonderful child doesn't mean having them do 5 hours of homework every night. It means getting them into the world. And that this is going to become a tenet of living. And so with that, I've been making bets on what I think the physical world will look like and become.
AI is really rapidly commoditizing many of our skills and knowledge. And I think one of the questions that comes up a lot, again, as consumers and as investors, is what does the AI renaissance mean for the future of work? How does it empower humans, rather than replace them? What does that look like in the next, 5, 10, 15 years in your view?
So I think the way we describe the next renaissance in the book from a work standpoint, well, first we explain it from a work standpoint. So we say, look, here's some things that are going to happen as it relates to the future of work. And we spell out the jobs that are more likely to automate on a technical basis, and we spell out the jobs that are more likely to augment on a technical basis. And then I call out something that I think is very important for everyone to acknowledge, which is that asking the question, what jobs are going to automate first, actually requires considering what unions are weakest. Like most jobs are not going to fully automate because most jobs are going to have exceptional political protection. And when you make the argument, oh, will the software engineer automate first? The reason that it's a decent argument is not that Claude Code is getting super good. It is. But the reason it's a decent argument is because software engineers have no political protection. They never organize. They have no union, and not a single congressperson, except for one or two in Seattle and San Francisco, are going to pass a bill to say we have to protect these people who make $700,000 a year. And so if you actually play out, wow, why would this group automate? It's because the politicians aren't coming to save them. And we see this all the time. I mean, one of the things I talk about in the book is that the reason that dock workers are not automated right now is political protection. They went on strike. They said, you cannot automate the ports. And we said, okay, you have 4 years. We'll keep it the same. And that brings me to the ultimate point that I will make, and then we'll conclude on this. People are making job automation an economic issue, and I think it's totally missing the point. Every time someone says we're going to automate work, and that means that someone's going to be, that creates economic pain. We talk about the unemployment rate, etc. I think we are actually missing the red herring and so much of what I make in the book, which is, and this will sound callous to some people, certainly those who have lost their jobs, but I have to say it anyway from an academic standpoint. The longshoremen who went on strike declaring that automation harms families and robots don't pay taxes, that's what their picket signs read, were all able to acknowledge when I interviewed them that the world would be cheaper if we automated shipping. And what we all forget as we have these debates about our job displacement is that we are all descendants of people whose jobs were automated to our economic benefit. And we never pay them a second thought. We don't think about what they went through in order for us to arrive at this moment. Moreover, we actually wander the earth basically all day asking, when is this good or service going to be better, faster, or cheaper, without realizing what we're asking is, when is a human going to be extricated from the manufacturing of this good or service? And we don't ask that question because we're jerks. We ask that question because we are rational economic actors conditioned to believe that everything should get better, faster, cheaper all the time, thanks to technology. And my argument is that automation is actually going to be one of the great boons, like a massive wave of job automation is going to be an economic boon that we can't even imagine. And the problem is not going to be that there is not more and better food on the table. The problem is going to be that people can't clearly say, this is who I am. That actually what we're facing is not a job displacement crisis, it's an identity displacement crisis. That at least a generation, and maybe two, will have to extricate the purpose and identity from work, which has been ingrained in us for thousands of years, to such an extent that the most common last name in the United States, the two most common last names in the United States are Miller and Smith, because we used to name ourselves after our professions. And I remind people of this, not to sound like a jerk when they say, well, whose job is going to automate? Because I don't want to say, well, yours, thankfully. But everyone, it turns out, is wandering around right now, wondering when everyone else's job is going to automate, just not theirs. Because they know that the world would actually be a whole lot better if taxes were easier to do, so the accountants got automated. If we could figure out radiology scans, so we didn't have to see a radiologist, so the radiologist could be automated. If we could figure out how to stand buildings up in minutes instead of years, so we automate the construction workers, we can all observe that world is better economically. The problem is the automation boundary. What is the limit of it? And I don't know, but my point in all this is talking about automation like it is this like pejorative is actually the issue, because the issue is at hand is purpose. The issue at hand is clearly identity. And I will add one more thing and then I'll go. or we can wrap this. When I wrote the book, I wrote it in homage to John Maynard Keynes, who wrote a paper in 1930 that I have read more than any other academic paper in my life. I've read it hundreds of times. I've memorized it verbatim. I could recite it to you now. And he wrote this paper against the backdrop of global despair and suffering. He wrote it at a time when people were literally dying of starvation in the street. And he was traveling Europe, giving this lecture series, and he came back to the States, and he wrote, and I quote, "I must now disembarrass myself to take wings into the future to imagine a world that I will certainly not live to see, one in which humans will have solved the economic problem and be faced with something more profound." The father of modern macroeconomics was arguing that on the horizon was a spiritual battle. And I totally agree. I look around the world and I'm like, the problem is not going to be, are we fed? The problem is not going to be, can I eat something? Can I do this thing? Can I buy this thing? The problem is going to be, am I spiritually satiated? Am I happy? And we're already seeing the effects of the device addiction on a standard of living that is going up all the time. The developed world is getting less happy. So what I tell people when they say, what's the future of work look like? I'm like, look, one, there's probably plenty of it. And two, if there isn't, good. Seriously, like something profound will happen on the other side and we might discover what it means to be human. But either you believe that everything is going to automate and we're going to have way more food and stuff, or you don't, and we're just going to continue to trudge along in our current sort of state. And I argue that something has to give. I think humans are meant for much more, and I'm not sure exactly what it is, but I do know that everyone is happiest when they're in physical community with friends and family, ideally outside. And I'm like, man, could technology, this technology in particular, finally give us the opportunity to do that, to actually congregate the way that our hunter-gatherer ancestors did, in a way that, Harari argues they might have been the happiest humans to ever exist because they had community and purpose sort of throughout their life. What if we are actually about to return to that?
Zach, I think you've given our audience and us as investors so much to think about. I think I speak for Rich and myself that we wish we could speak to you for 2 or 3 hours, such a wealth of knowledge on this topic. But thank you so much for joining us today. To our full audience, check out Zach's upcoming book, The Next Renaissance, AI and the Expansion of Human Potential. Thanks so much, Zach.
Thank you.
Thank you, Zach.